success of the women's movement in placing women's issues on the agenda of national and international institutions. Unlike some of my sisters and colleagues in the movement, I do not regard the success as something to celebrate unconditionally. Au contraire, as I hope to show, some of the mainstream acolytes of women and women's issues are not always to be trusted. In particular, I take a look at two recent books, both of them purporting to be in the name of feminism and women's emancipation. The first is the bestseller Half the Sky by New York Times columnist Nicholas Kristof and his wife Sheryl Wu Dunn. And the second is the equally well-known volume by Sheryl Sandberg, Leigh, which comes accompanied by a website and small peer groups that you and I can join. Hence my title, Leaning In and Holding Up Half the Sky. And by the way, a more recent book in the same vein was just issued by Jimmy Carter called A Call to Action, Religion, Violence, Women, Religion, Violence, and Power. Carter announced the other night in an interview on Al Jazeera that the issues facing women and girls are the most important issues in the world today. And the word feminism is not in his index. I checked. All right, so as noted, I want to place my discussion of these two volumes in the context of the analysis I did in my book, Feminism Seduced, in which I argue that the hard work and organizing and intellectual contributions of the second wave of the women's movement have been co-opted and used by corporations, national governments, and international financial institutions like the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, essentially to hijack feminism in the interests of globalized capitalist forces. My analysis points to what I have called a dangerous liaison, namely an unwitting alliance of mainstream or hegemonic feminism with the agents of neoliberalism. In my book, I ask the question, why has the worldwide women's movement failed to address a serious challenge to the hegemony of neoliberalism across the globe? Surely a movement to seek equality for the women of the world should have been part of the resistance to globalization, with its attendant shredding of the safety net and devastation of the public sector, an important employer of women. Instead, we have seen the rise of what I call hegemonic feminism, with capitalism, as I said. Overall, the book represents my attempt to bring together a Marxist political economic framework with a gender analysis, seeking to develop what is in effect a political economy of gender. I borrowed the term hegemony from Gramsci to refer to the dominant set of ideas established by ruling elites and accepted without question as the common sense of a society, and R.W. Connell's expression, hegemonic masculinity, to refer to that form of bourgeois feminism that argues for women's full incorporation into the economic life of capitalism as workers or managers or investors. Of course, the full range of demands brought forward by the brilliant activists and theorists of second-wave feminism, as we're reminded at this conference, would have, if met, produced a social revolution of a kind not previously either envisaged or accomplished in practice. From full access to reproductive rights, to an end to patriarchal violence, rape, incest, sexual trafficking, and racism. Education, housing, incomes for all, a range of family forms incorporating lesbian and gay rights, a sustainable environment, and so on. A socialist revolution with a feminist agenda, or maybe a feminist revolution with a socialist agenda. Instead, I argued that the demands of the women's movement in all its varieties have been cleverly and diabolically shaped by the dominant cultural and economic engines of capitalism, narrowed down into the most widely recognized and accepted meaning of feminism, namely paid work for women, along with access to the levers of capitalist power for an elite few. I argue in the book that this form of feminism has received widespread plaudits and acceptance as part of a broad imperialist agenda of cultural and economic domination by the US and the other rich countries. Seizing on feminism's core demand of paid work, A new vocabulary and set of ideals has been set forth, which has a particular ideological function. In contrast to the revolutionary ideals of those countries that have sought and continue to seek economic self-determination, such as Cuba, we are told that the key to ending poverty, creating wealth, and producing social justice is, in fact, the empowering of women. Since my book appeared, world history has accelerated. While I was writing the book, the process of structural adjustment had been applied to global South countries in Africa, Latin America, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia, as well as the formerly communist countries of Eastern Europe and Russia. But now we are seeing the application of these policies to the indebted countries of the global North, such as Ireland, Portugal, Spain, Greece most dramatically, and stay tuned for Ukraine. Labeled austerity, these policies intensify social and economic inequality, cripple the state apparatus, require the privatization of state entities, the dismantling of state functions such as education and housing, and seek the restructuring of the entire economy to serve the debt of bondholders and others with a stake in profiting from the ill-advised loans of an earlier era. And the process has come home with a vengeance in the Motor City of Detroit, where the claims of city workers to be paid the pensions they were promised are pitted against those of the financial elite. In this context, is it not obvious that an ideological commitment to the empowerment of women as individuals can in no way make up for the destruction of the capacity of the state to provide education, welfare, housing, and other services to its citizens, male and female? Let me now turn to the books I want to highlight. The first, as mentioned, is Nicholas Kristof and his wife Cheryl Woodun, whose best-selling book, Half the Sky, is now linked to a PBS special. In this, they call for a new women's movement comparable in scale and effectiveness to the anti-slavery movement of the early 19th century. Meanwhile, they leave out that there's been a women's movement for decades. And they call on people everywhere, but especially targeting a U.S. audience. I'm just checking the time, 10, all right, I'm rushing. To participate in the charitable enterprises bettering the lives of women everywhere. They echo the sentiments of the international financial institutions and the United Nations, saying that the improvement of individual women's lives will be the key to ending poverty and suffering in the third world. This book is sprinkled with inspiring stories of young women who have endured unbearable experiences. I'll spare you, but you can imagine fistulas, rape and assault, marital rape, sexual trafficking. In each case, the women that they target receive assistance, the last example in the book being the gift of a goat from Heifers International. And they end up overcoming their sufferings, becoming educated, and they rise to become a leader in their country. The moral of the story is clear. Women are the key to a more prosperous, just world, and interventions through charitable organizations can make unimaginable change happen. And of course, nowhere in their admittedly moving narrative is there any mention of the neoliberal policies with their devastating effects in third world countries carried out by your government and ours. All right, so similarly, you have to read Lean In by Sheryl Sandberg. This is a self-help book for women seeking to climb the corporate ladder, but finding themselves blocked by the glass ceiling. In contrast to Kristof and Woodun, who barely cite any feminist authors except Eve Ensler, Sandberg's notes are stuffed with citations to gender research on behavioral differences between men and women. Sandberg is convinced that we can eliminate discrimination against women, and of course, while of course there are real-world barriers to the United States, for women in the United States, including no universal child care, no paid maternity leave, unequal pay, sexual harassment, nonetheless, women have it within their power to lean in and take authority in a way that competitive men, including Cheryl's brother, whom she cites as her role model, do without thinking. Men always ask for a second offer when negotiating, says Sandberg, while women are inclined to take the first offer. Bad, bad. This book is written in a breathless, girly style, belying what must be the steely persona behind the elegant brunette depicted on the cover, chatting to the reader about the experiences leading her to write the book. She triumphantly recounts her victory in getting Google. She's now a COO of Facebook, and before that she worked for Google. She got Google to open parking spaces for pregnant women close to the office after trekking, heavily pregnant herself, from the furthest reaches of the parking lot. And lo and behold, all she had to do was ask. And this is now policy at her former company. And she sympathizes with what she portrays as the generic woman who was raised to smile and be nice, while her brother was trained to compete with no holds barred. All right, I'll skip to the end because I'm trying to be tough. Just let me say that in contrast to Jimmy Carter, the number one problem facing the world today is not the fate of women and girls, although that's part of it, but the fate of capitalism. Indeed, we could argue that the number one problem, the violation of rights of women and girls, is a primary symptom of what needs to change in the world, namely a system based on profits and private property. We're living in an era of what the French call savage capitalism, a system where regulation is systematically repealed or evaded, where there are few brakes on the intense pursuit of profit at the expense of human dignity, and where the dissolution of ties in families and communities has changed to the creation of competing individuals like Cheryl, who participated in an increasingly desperate struggle for jobs. Now, I'll just mention, I haven't got time to read the quote, but the great writer Linda Burnham calls this the feminism of the 1%. Is it possible that the discovery by the international elites is a progressive development? Am I wrong to interpret this entirely as a cynical use of feminism? Only time will tell. But I continue to argue that as feminists we should view the newly minted compassion of the Christophs, Woodons, Jimmy Carters of this world with profound suspicion. As for the admonition that we should lean in, Sandberg is really telling women that we should buy in and accept that the only real feminist position is to be climbing the ladder within a corrupt capitalist system. I hope that younger generations, and it's a pleasure to see them at this conference, will continue to be suspicious of this paradigm and ask how feminists can continue to build a tradition that points away from neoliberal capitalism and toward another world altogether. Thank you.
Hi there, how's the sound?
Great.
Okay, yeah. I'm Zoe Newman. I teach in the Department of Sociology at York University in Toronto. And I just want to start by thanking the organizers of the conference for making all this possible and having us here. And I want to thank you all for coming today. My paper is called "The Personal is Epistemological?" This paper starts from the important claim of the late 1960s women's liberation movement that the personal is political. And speaking of the personal being political, don't drink bottled water. Don't do it. We should not be privatizing water. So this paper starts from the idea that the personal is political, to revisit the insights, thank you by the way, to revisit the insights it offered and consider its continued relevance. I understand the phrase to contain within it several profound claims. That the experiences of the individual are rooted in and shaped by structural forces rather than reflective of some inner essence of that individual. The phrase, which I'll at times reduce to a hyphenated personal political, for reasons I hope should be obvious, is further testimony that an individual woman's personal narrative could be a vehicle for speaking truth to power, thereby becoming political by offering an exposé of systemic inequities. This deceptively simple statement, and the systemic mechanisms of social division that it speaks of, shaped a strategy for connecting women and building community, while simultaneously proposing an alternative way of thinking the world. So I'm going to offer a few propositions in this paper, the first being that we think of the personal as political as an epistemology. I'll first try to make my case for this interpretation, but for now let me say that as I was sitting in yesterday's panel on how to defang a movement, hearing about how the term epistemology is itself a sign of what troubles feminism, it occurred to me that quite simply, another way to say that the personal is epistemological is to say that knowledge is political. Thank you, Foucault. That is, the personal is political not only yielded the analysis and methods of identity politics, but also became the basis of an argument for experiential knowledge claims, which democratized the process of knowledge production by suggesting that ordinary women's firsthand experiences of sexism, racism, homophobia, and sometimes all of them at once, give them insight into the existence of structural inequality and domination. My second claim has to do with the continued relevance of the claim that the personal is political. Or maybe it's not quite right to call it the continued relevance, which suggests a static linear quality to the idea, its origins, and its applications. My interest here is rather in proliferating the interpretations of that phrase by tracing its linkages to other schools of thought. I'm tempted to call these connections promiscuous or polyamorous, in part to locate the theory's genesis within a collectivity of activist thinkers who, as the previous panel suggested, were both loving and angry. I regard the personal political linkage as having had many mothers, many siblings, and many offspring. I'm going to use that premise and the ethos that suffuses the personal political to briefly situate myself within feminist and liberationist theories, and I make this autobiographical turn not least of all because my mother and my daughter are both in the audience today. I take my cue from decolonizing theorists like Andrea Smith, who have refused to cede the indigenous definition and power of nation to the nation state, insisting instead that we can be family without a requirement of consanguinity or privatized, militarized notions of borders. More broadly, I'm going to take you on a little spin of two theories I see as embodying the personal political epistemology to demonstrate the many ways we continue to negotiate theory, identity, difference, and experience, and why we must continue to think the personal and the political as intertwined. But backing up for a moment, besides having had a flesh and blood mother, who in the 70s was all too briefly known as Frances Fireweed, I also claim myself as part of the larger messy feminist family. I was born in 1970, the same year Carol Hanish's piece, The Personal is Political, was published in Notes from the Second Year, Women's Liberation. By the early 1990s, I was a graduate student at OISE in Toronto, a time and place of passionate and sometimes fragmented debate between the Combahee River Collective's statement of the necessity of African American women speaking for themselves and the post-structuralist, post-colonial queer critiques of identity. Divisions that yesterday revealed themselves as still current, particularly around trans issues. I think of my grad school years as the heyday of identity politics and coming out strategies, alongside Joan Scott's great critique of experience and Trin Minha's analysis of dangers within white feminism for women of color who were accorded space only as native informants. Yet with Spivak's strategic essentialism, it was possible and even necessary to see bridges between embodied experience and multiple hybrid deconstructed selves. Carol Hanish writes of the early history of the phrase as a reaction to women in the US of the 1960s being told that discussions of personal experiences were laughable. This dismissal of consciousness raising as self-absorbed and not properly political is consistent with the long-standing division within liberalism that banished anything marked as feminine to the realm of bodily functions and enclosed spaces. To proclaim the personal as political was to point out the power relations embedded within women's and men's differing life events, as reproduced both institutionally and intimately. And yes, it was to say that bodily functions, sex and reproduction, menstruation and abortion, even hair and sweat, were also subject to power and were therefore in need of analysis. In tracing these links between individual women's personal experiences in order to recognize not only patterns of similarity, but also importantly difference, the blurriness of the boundary between home and state was asserted. Or as Hanisch wrote in 1969, quote, "It is at this point a political action to tell it like it is, to say what I really believe about my life instead of what I've always been told to say." I hear in these words the same sentiment the great revolutionary socialist Rosa Luxemburg expressed when she wrote, quote, "The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening." In this way, telling it like it is rejects normative conventions of feminine passivity and submission. But rather than being just an end unto itself, taking up space is also a process of articulating a transformative analytic and activist strategy. As Hanisch so clearly says, the goal of identifying personal problems was never to find personal solutions, as in the Sandberg's lean-in individualist strategies, but always to move towards, quote, "collective action for a collective solution," even as she acknowledges the potential for personal transformation and therapeutic effects in consciousness raisings. I am deeply appreciative for such calls to collective action in these days of neoliberalism and late capitalism, when individualism has once again trumped communalism, or it certainly seems that way at times. At the risk of sounding like I'm staging a battle between forces of good and evil, I think this is a tension we have seen repeatedly, when identity politics were co-opted into rights-based appeals and lifestyle politics. This again is something of a long-standing tension in women's liberation movements in the West, when the pull to come together and find commonality becomes universalistic sameness that rejects analysis of the many differences among women and excludes the need for different kinds of agendas and strategies. So there is a risk in saying the personal is political, when one person's experience is presumed to be applicable to all women. This treatment of experience and recentering of the universal subject is quite different from what I find so useful and powerful in the personal political linkage. The project of understanding how the two constitute each other, even or especially when personal and political affairs are being proclaimed as separate, which then requires that we investigate the processes by which those objects are produced as discrete. Here's perhaps where the crux of my shift towards epistemology lies. I was trained to understand and critique objectivity as a product of imperialism, as a vehicle by which the Enlightenment's proclamations of freedom and equality became a biologistic argument for denying full personhood to white women and men and women of color. Those same Enlightenment principles dictated that to achieve universal truths, it was necessary to stand separate from what you're researching, something deemed possible only for those whose minds were seen as unfettered by their bodies. So let me turn now to briefly consider two examples that speak to how to navigate those rocky shores of disembodied knowledge. In her 1999 article, My Body, Myself, How Does a Black Woman Do Sociology?, Felian Cueto Simmons describes the dangers and necessities of producing academic work about who you are, when who she is the only Black person in her department at Newcastle University. She says, quote, "In the final analysis, I might be an academic, but what I carry is an embodied self that is at odds with expectations of who an academic is." Simmons names lynching, incarceration, public exhibition, racial science, and academic research as having variously contributed to turning Black bodies into objects that have not been allowed to speak for themselves. More specifically, what she calls, quote, the spectacle of the colonized female subject in 19th century anthropological writings and readings of difference between the races, end quote, has insisted on reducing Black women to their bodies in the service of an epistemology designed to credit only white men with rationality. As a result, Simmons says, quote, for some of us, it is impossible to escape the body and its constructions, end quote. Being unable to escape your body means you can always be discredited as overly subjective or overly emotional, or as having only experiential knowledge rather than theoretical authority. The hitch is that you can theorize the body, but only if you remain disembodied. And only some people have that luxury, or only some people's bodies are considered separate from everything else about them. Simmons' embodiment means that when she reflects on her experiences as a Black woman, white people experience it as a challenge to the privilege of whiteness, as a requirement to examine their unexamined racial identity. But the issue her theorizing presents is an unsettling of white intellectuality, which rests on an apparently exclusive claim to abstract rational thought, in contrast with the status which Simmons names as the expectation that she will be but not know about being. The impossible artificial choice, then, is between being and knowing. So it's hard for Simmons to remain a disembodied scholar, even if that were her goal, but it's not, thankfully. What she strives for instead is giving a voice back to the body. She challenges us to try to talk about the body in an intellectual way, keeping in mind the history of how some bodies, like hers, have been so scrutinized that it has been made very difficult for them to speak for themselves. With a nod to Spivak's strategic essentialism, Simmons maps out a practice of simultaneously understanding the body as a mode of experience and as a social construct. She refers to this as reflexive sociology. It's about recognizing that there's a relationship between, as she says, being a sociologist and being a person. This speaks to the illusion of the public-private divide. Simmons says that the outcome of reflexive sociology is a transformation of theory, which is a way to ensure that Black academics and students don't, quote, remain permanent curiosities in academia. But perhaps equally urgent is that attention to bodily experience offers her a method for, quote, sorting through the fictions of theory when it comes to the meaning of her body. My second and final example of a moment when we can see the personal political linkage being asserted is Susan Stryker's 2008 article, Transgender History, Homonormativity and Disciplinarity. Stryker's use of homonormativity to refer to gender-normative gay and lesbian identity, echoing Judith Halberstam's work on female masculinity, is slightly prior to and different from Lisa Duggan's, which has tended to concentrate on neoliberal, racially assimilationist gay and lesbian politics. Stryker invokes homonormativity to suggest we understand it as an epistemology, whereas homonormativity tries to maintain either a biological basis to gender presentation or notions of stable identity formation, or both. By contrast, Stryker makes the claim that transgender scholarship, whether work by trans scholars themselves or work on trans issues, has anti-normative tendencies, at very least by throwing into question the biologistic foundations of and within gender categories. But perhaps more to the point, in its embrace of gender binaries and direct causal lines between anatomy and identity, Stryker argues that homonormative knowledge, certainly in its disciplinary form within the academy, contributes to, quote, disqualifying the very modes of knowing threatening to disrupt the smooth functioning of normative space. Depending on the community and the setting, this disqualification might take the form of dismissing trans people as mentally unstable and therefore not rational, or as reactionary and therefore not to be trusted. Just skip ahead. So Stryker essentially says how this manifests itself in her own work, But she, like Simmons, is optimistic. She also talks about new strategies through which disruptive knowledges can dislodge the privileges of normativity. As I understand it, the radical call for structural change that the personal political offers us requires dismantling the epistemologies of the master's house, which unimaginatively insist that we must be either the same or different, rational or embodied. Thank you.
We're going to try to practice feminist theory making in front of you. We'll see how this goes. This paper takes the form of a dialogue between
Eileen, who fled from housework that consumed her mother's days into the academy by way of women's liberation,
and Leigh, whose family's lessons in rummaging and thrift elevated housework into a resource for making do, lessons which he took with her upon entering elite colleges. It comes from our reading together as professor and PhD student your texts on housework, including The Power of Women in the Subversion of the Community, that 1972 Mary Rosa Della Costa and Selma James text, but also reflects the personal and political investments we bring to understanding the meanings of housework in the era of women's liberation and beyond. We present this dialogue as an extended conversation and actually created it in conversation, recorded it, transcribed it, and now have edited it, and now are reenacting it, and will not get through it. But we do this as a form of analysis that represents one way that feminists generate theory through conversation itself. In short, we claim the household as a site for political struggle and utopian vision that can actually be visualized and lived in the present.
wages for housework was a position more developed in Britain and Italy than in the United States, although Radical America published a version of the Dalla Costa and James Manifesto. It comes out of Marxist autonomist feminism, a tendency less pronounced in the US, where most feminists were more often cast housework only as part of the struggle between men and women under patriarchy, rather than considered whether the housewife produced use or exchange value, or whether she generated surplus value under capitalism. We were provoked by a simplistic reading of this work in a New York Times op-ed a year ago by Kristen Wortman, which reduced wages for housework to pay people to cook at home as a way to improve our health and welfare, while castigating U.S. feminists for their emphasis on equal pay, which only led to a second shift after going out to work.
Yet wages for housework was no simple call for paying for housework, but an attempt to move away from Engels' idea that women's liberation would emerge from employment outside of the home. Such labor, that is, housework, was productive labor, not merely reproductive, this text claims. Housework was exploitation, not love, as Della Costa and James declare. Slavery to an assembly line is not a liberation from slavery to a kitchen sink. They believe the struggle within the family was necessary, but also women sharing an identity from their home labor provided a standpoint for socialized struggle that in turn required time away from housework. As historian Maud Ann Bracke has documented in the context of the Italian campaigns during the 1970s, the labor force participation of Italian women was declining in the 1960s and 1970s. So organizing them in terms of their labors in the home made sense in the autonomous tradition. As a tactic, wages for housework provided respite from double burdens, allowed for a shared consciousness based on similar labor, and declared care as work, making such labor visible. It stemmed from, as we said, autonomous worker strand of Marxism that emphasized organizing at the point of production for those who did similar labor. It made reproductive labor legible as work. A limit of this vision that Kathy Weeks actually has shown. But James and Della Costa saw their demand leading to a reduction in overall work time, claiming, "We have worked enough, ours is a struggle against work." And continue, okay. And in this vein, we might place the cause of welfare rights during the same time as a struggle against work. which sought income, not work fare. That is, wages for housework echoes as well as reflects demands of the welfare rights movement for recognition of the reproductive labors engaged by mothers and women who care for their home and family, and might in its call for visibility. And I should add a call that was made by African American women and other women of color be seen in relation to the domestic worker movement of its day and our own, with its calls for respect, labor standards, and higher wages. That is, wages for housework, stood as a rethinking of what work is and its relationship to power within the family and outside of it in a racialized, gendered vein.
Finally, we're interested in the potential of this past for the present. At a moment when popular media touts the retro housewife and celebrates new urban homesteaders, when social commentators tell middle-class and professional women that we can't have it all, or that we should lean in, and a global movement of domestic workers is demanding another world of work, through our own intergenerational dialogue, we hope to rethink and engage in our own propagation.
So we're going to go to the personal, the connection. On one hand, this is a provocation because so much of feminism in the U.S., we do agree, has been a retreat from the household, a fleeing away. Most feminists of the 1960s and the 1970s, my generation, did not want to be just a housewife. I can remember learning 2 lessons from my mother's housewife experience. The first, that women are more competent than men, as I saw my mother running the household in my father's business, but not getting any credit for it. She got no wages for her dual housework in this small, petty, entrepreneurial, capitalist household. Second, we saw housework as a site of oppression and exploitation, but it was also a place of women's work. My mother was much more competent. She did everything, including putting my hair in curlers, even though I didn't want it. Those of us influenced by the civil rights struggles of the day also recognize the ways in which the racialization of paid household work further devalued such labor. So women's liberation on the one hand meant moving away from the home and socializing the necessary labor performed in the home. Those of us who are part of the socialist feminist tendency certainly made demands such as 24-hour community-run childcare. We saw the possibilities in the removal of household labor into other spaces like food co-ops, but we further developed an analysis of its commodification through fast food, through takeout, dry cleaning, etc. We began to connect home laborers to women's work in the low-wage service sector, which employed some of the same men and women who were othered by race and ethnicity and still relegated to underpaid and servile forms of household labor. The home also was seen as a site of struggle through the sexes over the household. And so Pat Maynard's The Politics of Housework certainly was another your text. From her, I learned to feign, I don't know how to sweep, I don't know what to do. You do it better, you do the laundry. So I can't really complain when my partner shrinks my cotton clothing because I'm not willing to do that work. But it remains difficult to dismiss the immaterial labor of organizing the household, which remains even when male partners do the physical labor. The reproductive labor, socialist feminists later elaborated, now has a critical name, immaterial labor, and it's been elaborated by affect theory.
So I feel kind of that the type of feminisms that celebrated this retreat from the home emerged from a really particular class location. But it was not just the housewife that Dalla Costa and James placed at the center of their analysis. It was the working class housewife. And the working class housewife was never just a housewife. By default, the working class housewife was engaged in a diverse array of labors, both paid and unpaid, capitalist and non-capitalist, in order to secure the reproduction of the household. I grew up in a household where both of my parents, a mother and a father, worked full-time, and they split housework, basically out of necessity for what needed to be done. My mother and my father were definitely socialized into performing different forms of work, but they were forms of work that were not only gendered but classed, and I think that's really important. For example, my father, who grew up in poverty working on farms and cars, a skilled sheet metal tradesman, handled repairs and maintenance, work that's typically coded male, but also cooked, ironed, and cleaned even more than my mother. Growing up, he had had to develop these skills out of necessity and had a deep appreciation for a clean home after following years of homelessness. So my parents were also vehemently anti-consumerist, although this did not come from a political stance or a concern for the environment. whatsoever, as we burned coal like no one's business because it was cheap and hot. But it was a cultural class practice, rather. My parents and my family and myself, we pride ourselves on rummaging in thrift, on reusing and repairing rather than buying new. We were inspired by a very do-it-yourself work ethic. So I grew up seeing a lot of value in housework and reproductive labor more generally, for in my family it was not just housework. It was the highly skilled work of gardening, canning, preserving, trading skills, time, and goods with neighbors and friends, sewing, mending, and building, basically something out of nothing. So there was no performance of incompetence in my household, as Maynard bemoans when she complains about her hip activist boyfriend in the 1970s, lamely attempting to do the dishes in my household when things just needed to be done. They needed to be done.
I'm going to skip ahead, I won't tell you about my ice cream man father. Okay. Over the years, my mom shed some of the practices that seemed very similar. She was second generation immigrant, cooked ethnic food, made things from scratch, but she began to use frozen food and canned stuff. And even I remember the first time we went to a hamburger chain, because for her, that was liberating, not to have to cook. The political moment in the US was different than in Italy, where women were trying to get into wage labor and join unions. Or for some of us in socialist feminists, Del Costa and Silvia Federici, particularly her Wages Against Housework, that's from 1975, made sense. As Federici put it, it is a demand by which our nature ends and our struggle begins, because just to want wages for housework means to refuse that work as the expression of our nature, and therefore to refuse precisely the female role that capital has invented for us. I find her words still so powerful. Let me quote her again. We want and must say that we are all housewives, we are all prostitutes, and we are all gay, because as long as we accept these divisions and think that we are something better, something different than a housewife, we accept the logic of a master. That is, I think, a form of strategic essentialism. Hers was a cultural component to the structural analysis of the value of such labor that underscored the constructions of womanhood that bolstered the extraction of surplus value and generated alienated labor. I remember being so taken with the domestic labor debate when I discovered it in the mid-1970s. I remember thinking, this is right, the household is a place of production as well as reproduction, and maybe they're very similar. I understood that from studying about slavery, because I knew that the enslaved woman, reproduction was a form of production, and her body was extracted. Her alienated labor was an alienation of the South, and it was a site of struggle between mistress and maid. We can take that historical understanding and apply it to later social movements, as I alluded to earlier, with the welfare rights movement and the domestic worker movement. And it really was in the late 1960s and the early 1970s that the domestic workers movement emerged from civil rights and welfare rights and taught us, particularly those of working in low-income neighborhoods, the various social reform agencies or poverty agencies, the domestic labor does have much value and leads to community survival. That connected to our political analysis that we were learning from Wages for Housewives, the debate made us ask, does the housework or worker work for the man or for the man, as Johnny Tillman had put it? All these factors came together for me when I started my dissertation work, actually on alternatives to industrial capitalists during the Victorian period with the arts and crafts movement.
And somewhat inspired by Eileen's work, I'm really interested in thinking about what Wages for Housework offers to the contemporary craft and do-it-yourself cultural movement, particularly in the context of alternative economic activity. So we can understand craft and do-it-yourself culture as autonomous in some sense, in the sense that it is not a rejection of work itself, but rather a rejection of an exploitative waged relation and a sense of creative fulfillment that resists alienation from one's work. So I'm interested in what happens to some of these practices, like the practices I grew up participating in, quilting and canning, when they're commodified, commercialized, and marketed to the middle and upper middle classes as a way to escape the exploitation and alienation of waged work. And here we can recall the caution about liberation from the kitchen sink, because increased access to the wage has not meant the end of unpaid labor for women, and it certainly hasn't meant the transformation of work such that men can also, or we can all participate in our own social reproduction. People work now more than ever, and social reproduction has been increasingly commodified and monetized, made quick and convenient. In a recent interview, Federici argued that, quote, instead of the feminization of waged work, we should speak of the masculinization of women's labor, as employment has forced us to adapt to an organization of work that is still premised on the assumption that workers are men and they have wives at home taking care of the housework. So you can see the appeal of the retro housewife who gardens and cooks organic produce from scratch for those who can afford it. However, wages for housework demonstrates that reproductive labor has a double nature. It is both for the man and the man. And disentangling the reproduction of capital from the reproduction of your family, of your class, of your social movement, of your struggle for justice is an important insight.
And I'm going to just keep slightly ahead again. So I want to argue that there was some general agreement on the left among feminists that about the housewife under capitalism, but what was the solution? The Wages for Housewife Work campaign, sought to show the value of what too often appears done out of love or obligation. But on one hand, there were some people like Marilyn Waring who updated in a radical feminist vein the notion, well, let's count women's work for the gross national product. And there were other of us who wanted to build a fairer welfare, a better welfare state, which seemed possible. It's hard to remember 50 years ago that the war on poverty appeared as a moment in which another world could be built through grassroots efforts, a lot of ferment. The autonomy that we see in the Italian movement was also stepping out of the male left for an autonomous women's movement. While we shared the idea of the home being a place of oppression, we in the US were not totally convinced that the welfare state was the enemy. Well, maybe because it was a residual and not very robust in the US, but we thought that you could transform this state, make it better, and make it work as a more just state. We wanted feminist revolution, but we would have been very happy for living wages and for a guaranteed family income for all that was real. But today, with the shrinking and the disappearance not only of the Great Society, but the New Deal order, though that had its problems, we really have to look and push back against any attempt to use the state for social, we have today a pushback against using the state for any social assistance. But so in this context, I have to ask, and I want to end with this, to what extent are these utopian demands actually more realistic today, ironically, because they don't involve the state, because they don't involve state bureaucracy? That is there a convergence in the peculiar way, in a very peculiar way, between the individualist, monetized, marketized, non-state position of neoliberalism and those anti-statist, anarchist, autonomous organizations? Perhaps it's more feasible to have alternatives within capitalism than to have state-run programs, a welfare state.
Thank you. My name is Judy Gumbo Albert. I am a feminist, an anti-war activist, and a yippie. I was wondering for quite some time as to why my presentation, which is about surveillance, how did it fit on this panel? But then actually when my fellow Canadian was talking, I said to myself, I get it, because surveillance is a highly political issue that affects, guess what? Every one of us, very, very personally. So, I wrote the piece that I'm about to present actually before Edward Snowden made his revelations, and it's published in a book which you can get at the book area called The Times They Were Changing, Women Remember the 60s and 70s, and I actually think that you might find a lot of things of interest for you in it. Now, I am not an expert in metadata, I'm not a techie, but I do when I look back on what I'm about to read you about what happened to me, what I really have come to understand is nothing has changed. Nothing has changed except the scope of the technology and its capacity to reach out to an extraordinarily broad audience. All right, so here we go, right? I'll begin by quoting from my FBI file. Attempts have been made to interview subject, that's me. However, during these attempts, subject, inside her apartment, was able to avoid facing the interviewing agents and made the statement, "See my attorney," through the door. Another attempt will be made to interview subject in New York. This attempt will take place while subject is on the street or getting into a car. A face-to-face confrontation is deemed worthwhile. I remember a time when all my friends suspected they were under surveillance. It may have been true. It may have been the myth of being watched revived our sense of self-importance at a time when our power to change the world was ending. My partner Stu and I had once been yippies. Yippies used the media to create myths that were bigger than reality. We ran a pig for president, brought the New York Stock Exchange to a halt by throwing money at stockbrokers, and levitated the Pentagon. By 1973, we might as well have crumbled what remained of our yippie legerdemain into a pot pipe and smoked it. The FBI neither forgave nor forgot. Agents would come knocking on the black metal door of Stu's and my New York City apartment with monotonous regularity. I grabbed the 4-foot-long steel rod that braced the deadbolt into my floor and verbally abused them from behind my closed door. Fed up with this hyper-vigilant life, Stu and I decided on impulse to quit New York City to leave the FBI and our public lives behind. In the early summer of 1973, Stu and I rented a tiny cabin in the Catskill Mountains off Highway 28A, 2.5 hours north of New York City, a half-hour drive from Woodstock, up a hill, behind a trailer occupied by two lanky elderly alcoholics who I'd hear argue with each other as I'd ride by. The front lawn outside our cabin was a cushion of aromatic brown pine needles where I could sit, roll a peaceful joint, and listen to Senator Sam Ervin, a hoot owl on the radio, say, "I'm just a simple country lawyer," as he took the Nixon administration apart. A balmy October seduced me with its warmth and downpour of red, yellow, and gold leaves. I had determined to continue to live a yippie life, provocative, oppositional, and as much as Stu and I could make it, neither paranoid nor serious. Still, both paranoia and seriousness dribbled into our mountain refuge. One friend, terrified by the war on African Americans and the counterculture, disguised as the war on drugs, escaped New York City during a drug scare instigated by that same Governor Rockefeller who ordered the massacre of prisoners at Attica. My friend deposited with us a green plastic garbage bag filled halfway up with low-grade marijuana. I buried her stash under a fence of flat gray stones that some forgotten pioneer had piled on one on another to mark our property line. Rip Van Winkle, or so the story goes, had inhabited these very mountains. I told myself I hid the pot in case Rip woke up looking for a toke. Still, after that visit, I revived my city habit of listening for clicks on the phone. 2 years later, in early winter of 1975, Stu and I decided to visit the urbanity of New York City, to inhale its excitement while taking the opportunity to drop in on Bill Kunstler and Margie Ratner, friends who happened to be lawyers. I hoped that such a visit would help dispel the paranoia that now threatened to despoil our rural isolation. In the city, I parked our yellow Volvo close by Bill and Margie's Gay Street home in Greenwich Village. I could not put my finger on it exactly, but the air around me felt charged with suspicious icons. I spotted, or so I thought, a man in a beige trench coat and fedora lurking in the dark shadows of a nearby stairwell. I ignored him. This is New York, I told myself. Everybody lurks in New York. Early in the morning of December 13, Stu and I returned to our car. Again, I saw a man. This time his trench coat was black. I watched him scurry down the sidewalk, a rat exposed to daylight. I worried I'd succumb to New York City paranoia, Then, in one of those moments, which I now call my feminist intuition, for which I am forever grateful, I decided to walk around my car's perimeter, looking for I knew not what, which is exactly when I saw it. A smear in the middle of the rear bumper, as if some employee at a car wash had tried to wipe away the dirt I had accumulated on the trip down. In the center of the spot, a black wire hung down, 6 inches long. I squatted in the gutter, avoiding a stream of gray ice water as best as I could, and contemplated the wire. The curiosity I've had my entire life, trumped any foreboding. I called Stu over. "What do you think this is?" I asked. Stu looked at the wire, stroked his beard, shook his head, but made no comment. He'd grown up in New York City and knew nothing about cars. I tried to teach him to drive once on an empty Catskill road, but cut my lesson short after he growled his way through 2 stop signs without stopping. Still, I needed Stu's reassurance. 3 weeks earlier, in a fit of know-it-all feminist machismo, I'd installed a new battery in my Volvo by myself, poles reversed, and sent the car's electrical system up in smoke. I've subsequently learned that fear can breed recklessness in addition to passivity. I told myself that if the wire came from a bomb placed under my car by the FBI or some God knows who right-winger, going out in a flaming blaze of glory would be a quintessential yippee act. Such a death might at least attract the media. "You wait on the sidewalk," I commanded to Stu. "I'm going to turn the engine on and see if it starts." Stu refused. He sat down heavily in the passenger seat. He told me later he did not want to see a headline that read, "Sexist Survives." I turned the key. No expectant silence, no click, no explosion. The Volvo's engine kicked in. My breath rushed out of my lungs as if escaping jail. I returned to the rear of the car and knelt once more in the freezing slush. I reached my arm up behind my No Nukes bumper sticker. My finger brushed an object I knew did not belong. I tugged, my hand emerged, clutching a size C battery attached to a piece of 3/4 inch black electrical tape. Stu and I spoke in one voice, "Let's get the fuck out of here." The more I navigated 79th Street curves through Central Park, the more a caravan of cars, one blue, one green, one beige, all American, followed me. After I reached the west side and turned down Broadway, I spotted a Comme des Chinois sign blinking in neon red and gold. Across from it was an empty parking spot. "Time to go for Chinese," I managed to get the words out. Stu agreed instantly. Chinese food is comfort food for Jews of my generation. I parked, leaving my ancient Volvo to its fate. Stu headed toward the farthest end of the restaurant, his face ashen under his blonde curls. An indifferent waiter plopped down 2 bowls in which barbecued pork and white tofu shards floated like creatures in an oil slick. The soup's steam smelled like fearwood, if fear came coated in tamarind and chili oil. "Back to Bill and Margie," Stu said after Soup had freed his brain to strategize. I agreed. If you think you're in trouble with the law, the best place to be is with your lawyers. No cars followed us to Gay Street. With longer arms and stronger fingers than I could ever dream of, Bill pulled an object from under the Volvo's bumper. It was a box made of black metal. It was 6 inches long by 4 inches wide. The number 107 was scratched on one side. An antenna hung off the other side, attached by a putty-like substance. 2 size C batteries were secured top to bottom with black electrical tape. All 2 batteries were intact, Bill said. I believe this might be the first time in my experience that one of these was actually found by someone. Over the years, I've asked myself, which of us, me or the FBI, was the bigger schmuck? I was foolish enough to abandon my car in front of that Chinese restaurant. The FBI agents had replaced the tracking device I'd disabled with a brand new, fully functioning one. Had they not done so, all I've had to show I was being followed would have been a single size C battery and a piece of crumpled black electrical tape. I'm just skip a little bit, but inside I felt elated. I'd been awarded the grand prize, proof positive that Stu and I were under surveillance. I discovered decades later that the FBI had vented their frustration with an observation to their superiors worthy of Franz Kafka. Subjects are difficult to surveil because they are paranoid about being surveilled. So not only did the FBI plant a tracking device on my car, they also burglarized my cabin and installed a listening device in a lamp fixture for 10 days. We subsequently sued and discovered that that information flow about the burglaries, the listening device, our mail, went all the way up the FBI food chain to L. Patrick Garay, who was then the acting director of the FBI, and he was being groomed to succeed J. Edgar Hoover. Also indicted was Mark Felt, the key decision maker on FBI domestic spying, who turned out to be Deep Throat, the source who spilled the beans about the Watergate burglary that ultimately led to the resignation of President Richard Nixon. So I like to claim a minuscule part in that act. Let me just say today two things: that our slide toward the surveillance state reached its zenith with the Patriot Act after 9/11 and continues to be enforced against all forms of vigorous protest, minor criminal conduct, people of any ethnicity, race, gender, no matter what it happens to be, and that even if you, wherever you work, and even if you use Facebook, YouTube, Google Maps, Skype, Apple, or Verizon, you too are a potential target of surveillance. And then I want to end by saying this, that everything that the FBI did to us in 1975 is entirely legal today.
All right, I want to thank the panelists for exceptional feminist discipline. So we have time for questions. So people can question anybody, and I just want to make sure, I could either repeat the question or you could come use the mic, whichever you want to do. Yes, great idea. Yeah, so let's do 2 or 3 questions, and then we can come back for another round. They've completely forgotten the other papers by now. Don't be shy. Or comments.
Well, I have a question. Thank you all very much for your papers. I was thinking when you were talking about your family history and your relationship to craft and DIY, I was thinking about Martha Stewart as maybe a prime example of the sort of commodification and selling back. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on, I mean, if you want to say more about this kind of cultural moment of marketing DIY and housework back to upper middle class women. That can be one of the 3 questions.
That was broke the ice, thank you.
Yes.
I have a question about data collection and statistical analysis that would show trends like exploitation and not you're getting out of the personal or interpersonal level of what wounds or hurts like in the workplace. I work with teachers. I'm a teacher and teachers union, and those of you that know what's happening in public schools know that surveillance has entered the realm of data collection. Teachers are being expected to demonstrate their impact on student growth through statistical analysis, test scores, for example. But I in the year that your book came out, Professor Eisenstein, on social feminism, I began to understand that as a structural picture. The problem is we have nothing to fight back with as teachers at the moment that actually sticks, I think, but to go personal and to say we want emotional, meaningful, genuine relationships between a teacher and a student. And if you keep making us prove our worth through all of this data, we never have any, teaching, any human relationship at all. But it worries me because, as a union person right now, we have emotional manipulation. I was sharing this in the panel, being used to scare teachers out of thinking statistically, structurally. Say, oh, it's really hurt that you went to the union. Can't we just talk this out of this policy? This erasure of what is, frankly, a power relationship in a workplace. So how do we use the data back in the way that the progressives would, right? To show inequity to show problems without getting into a debate over whose measurements are going to be the more scientific and the more valid.
It's hard to summarize that question, but she's speaking as a teacher and a union organizer and saying that data is being used against teachers now and making it impossible to have human relations with the kids. But how do you fight back without using data? Don't we need to have our own data? Is that a fair summary? Just to clarify, the Socialist Feminist book is not me, that's my colleague Zilla Eisenstein, 1979.
I'll give it later, I'm sorry.
That's okay. All right, let's take another one.
This is for Eileen and maybe Leigh. At the end, Eileen, you said something about utopian demands might be more realistic today, in part because they're not directed at the state. And so I'm assuming utopian demands including basic income or shorter hours that are demands for time and money to individuals rather than state programs in some ways. And you said, the suggestion is that they are in some ways consistent with kind of neoliberal logics about individuals not expecting things from the state and not making claims on the state. And does that make them better or worse? I mean, in some ways you're kind of suggesting, it seems to me, that they might be limited for that reason or maybe even counterproductive. And I just wanted to see if you would elaborate a little bit.
So just the idea of it being more possible to make some kind of utopian demands without the state in a neoliberal era, how would you make sure those demands are effective, I guess?
Right.
Yeah. Is that fair? Yeah.
Right.
Okay, should we take maybe one more, or do you want to go?
Let's take one more, because that's all the time.
Yeah, that's all the time. Let me take the person that
Answer them afterwards.
I want to build on this thing about the teachers and ask you when you comment on it, if you could also look at it in terms of the issue of class. Middle class work is work where people have autonomy, they're assumed to be professionals, to know what they do. Teaching is traditionally female role in the society, and what we're seeing happen is it's being relegated to working class, highly supervised. We're going to tell you exactly what to say, we're going to monitor you carefully. So there's a class element to this as well that I'd like to address.
That's a really interesting point, that the role of teacher had become middle class in the sense of professional, autonomous, and in the context of all this data collection, it's being relegated to a working class, disciplined, prescribed kind of profession. No longer a profession, just a kind of work. Very interesting. Okay, let's do some answers.
Well, I just wanted to, for people who are asking about data collection, I just wanted to talk about fear. There's a lot of fear about what people are going to do, and the government and whatever surveillance agency in terms of the teachers are going to do with that data. The answer from my personal experience is stand up to it and do not be afraid. Don't let the fear get to you. If you don't let it get to you, then the techniques for how to confront it will come somehow or other through the tech community, but it's the fear element that keeps us disempowered and keeps us from fighting back. So that's my comment.
I want to answer Kathy there. Actually, I don't think shorter hours is a utopian demand. I think it's a possible victory. So, and it's actually what's being struggled right now, jobs for justice and many other labor groups, some unions, some not. So what would be considered utopian in this context of a market-based or an individualized anti-status moment that we're in. And I was kind of thinking of what Leigh is investigating, which she didn't have a chance to say, these Gibbs and Graham kind of alternative exchanges, an alternative, well, I'll let you talk.
So, kind of this question about utopian demands and whether or not they're more feasible in this moment when people are retreating from the state as the state continues to shrink, is kind of emerges out of a conversation about my work, which is about alternative economic activity, and the kind of alternative utopian visions that kind of something like, for example, a local exchange trading system, might enact as an alternative to a market economy. So I think that in some sense these utopian demands or utopian visions are more realistic. I mean, they work for people. I think people are sick of holding their breath for the state to make something happen. So what my work kind of looks at is what happens when these working class practices or these sort of ways of getting by and making do that are often illegible to the state, what happens when they become legible? What happens when they start to become commodified and commercialized and made available to a wider variety of people, more upper class and middle class people? So that's kind of what my work looks like.
Right, and we're very interested in the tension. What does legibility mean when you come then under, as we talk later in our dialogue, so you have these alternatives, then zoning laws come in, and so various ways to undermine as well as so you can establish them in this period, maybe easier than getting shorter hours or living wages with the shrinking of organized, not only trade unions, but now right-wing forces are going after worker centers and saying they're really trade unions. So there's a whole way that this neoliberal moment is, I think, disrupting what we think is possible and what we think is utopian, that we can seize too, because as you point out and remind us, we who are here now cannot predict what, and should not try to predict the future that we're building, because we together are building that future.
Want to take another?
Because I think the data question is really about your objectification.
I was certainly thinking about that in relation to your question about being required to quantify learning. Certainly in Canada and Ontario, there's been a massive standardization of elementary school and secondary school, with standardized testing and the requirement that teachers be able to sort of demonstrate that their students possess certain knowledges. At the university level, at the university I teach, we're undergoing something that's called academic prioritization, which I think is a theory devised by somebody from your great country, whereby all the departments now are being asked to answer these very standardized questions, and you have to answer them. The questions themselves are often about 200 to 300 words, but the answers then can only be about 300 words, where you have to demonstrate all the ways that your department fits into the university's overall plan. So it also occurs to me that we've had a feminization of universities and university teaching. I mean that there's possibly some kind of parallel that we can trace. But I mean certainly for me there's this notion of knowledge as quantifiable and the notion of objective truths. This rings as something that I'm concerned about.
All right, maybe take one or two other questions. We're running out of time, but we have about 5 minutes. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I actually had a comment.
Good.
I was one of the few graduate students at Berkeley who was pregnant at the time. The other person who had actually had a baby and completed the degree, became Susan Stryker, started as Rick Ferguson. And that baby is now graduating from college. And I'm so excited, and this goes to your comment. She's at Smith. The campus had a common read, right, Half the Sky. And, where in the past, Rachel Maddow and some of these other speakers had come in, this year the new president named Christine Lagarde. And so I got a phone call from my daughter. This is one of her first big political moves, saying, okay, we're holding a teach-in on structural adjustment. It was so extraordinary to me that these young people who had been coached, right, and had rejected it, were now being, sort of really understanding, I think, and taking sort of steps. So it was sort of, I guess I wanted to share that and to see if maybe if you are seeing some of this kind of mobilization around, these popularized narratives that are creating frustration, not just the men, but also out the stuff.
That's absolutely.
All right, I'll just say that you're talking about your daughter as part of a new generation that's educated enough to talk about, just protest the beautiful and talented Christine Lagarde, she's the current head of the IMF. And to say, let's do a teach-in about structural adjustment, pretty sophisticated. That's wonderful. All right, guys, I think we should stop and thank the panel for wonderful.
Question.